Hello, welcome to ThinkTech Asia, coming to you from downtown Honolulu. I'm your host, Hong Jiang, Associate Professor of Geography at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And my guest today is Merritt Sakata, and our topic is Let Us Pray for World Peace. So Mr. Merritt Sakata recently closed his architectural practice, and he's been very active in the promotion of world peace in Hawaii. And he spent a lot of his time and effort on various community initiatives in Hawaii, fostering world peace. And his own practice has been informed by the spiritual practice of a Seicho-No-Ie, where he serves as a lay teacher. So today, Merritt will talk about some of these initiatives he has been involved in Hawaii to bring about world peace. And Merritt, thank you so much for
Thank you very much for
here.
asking me. I had no idea that this thing was going on, so it was kind of a surprise when you asked.
And our audience will be surprised with the wealth of knowledge that you have. I mean, you are just a tremendous person in the community.
I don't know, but we'll see.
I remember meeting with you a few years back at this international forgiveness project. Maybe we can start from there, talk
Sure.
about your involvement
Sure.
with the project and what this project is about.
Sure. Today I'm about 67 years old, so I'm not too young anymore. And during the 1960s, when I was going to college, obviously there were a lot of things going on in the world. Having grown up in the 50s and early 60s, things were, very, very conventional. But by the time the mid-60s came along, in addition to civil rights, in addition to other kinds of international conflicts and things becoming very obvious, it became very obvious to me that despite the ideals that we in this country may have, our actual impact in the world may be not all that consistent. Mm-hmm. Because of that, I became a conscious objector. Mm-hmm. And since I became a conscious objector, it became obvious to me that the typical person in the country, being a good person, tends to unquestioningly trust what is going on, thinking that must be true. And when you come to realize that maybe the reality is not quite so consistent, mm-hmm. then you start to realize why the conflicts do exist. So mm-hmm. until our understanding is broad enough to appreciate the point of view of the person who seems to be our opponent, mm-hmm. it's kind of hard to come to an understanding. So mm-hmm. if there is to be world peace, it really is self-development on our part first. So that's the approach that I use.
Maybe before we get to talk about some of these projects you're involved, including the forgiveness project, maybe we'll have you talk a little bit about world peace. You touched upon it. Yes. Like a peace is almost like a state of the mind, yes. of the heart, right?
Yes. Because you're Chinese, you probably would understand this, but many other people that are watching probably have no idea. And being of Japanese ancestry, it occurs to me from my past experience and my own study that much of what makes Japan Japan is they adopted probably the epitome of what is Chinese philosophy, government, and actually social structure. Mm-hmm. And because Hawaii, just like Japan, is an island, it's kind of easy to kind of get it together because you're living in a castle surrounded mm-hmm. by a moat. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're living in a continent, it's not quite so obvious because people just move around at will, and it's very hard to have a stable population we can actually work on them. Mm-hmm. And so probably the only course I took at the University of Hawaii was a night school course, which happened to be in sociology. And I was really, really influenced by the first writing in this book on sociology, which was actually a quotation from Confucius. Mm-hmm. And the quotation from Confucius is what they call the dashui. I don't know.
The great learning.
Yeah, the great learning. And in Japan, I don't know if in China, the great learning, daigaku, we pronounce in Japanese, is what the word they use for college. In other words,
yes, the same.
Yes, the same word.
In China,
yes,
the university.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to just read this because I think it informs perhaps how we might want to structure ourselves if indeed the goal is for people to get along.
For peace, right?
That's right, for peace, just to get along. I mean, peace is the result of people getting along. So if we strive for peace, we have to do those things that lead to that condition. There's no use trying to go get this thing if all these things do not lead to that result.
That's right,
So anyway, this is attributed to Confucius. Now, every translation will be different because I cannot tell you in Chinese. I have to talk in English. I'm relying that on this translation being reasonably appropriate. And it's called the Great Learning. It says, the ancients who wished to exhibit illustrious virtue throughout the kingdom and to govern the world peacefully first ordered well their own states. Wishing to order well their own states, they first regulated their families. Wishing to regulate their families, they first cultivated their persons. Wishing to cultivate their persons, they first rectified their hearts. Wishing to rectify their hearts, they first sought to be sincere in their thoughts. Wishing to be sincere in their thoughts, they first extended to the utmost their knowledge. Such extension of knowledge lay in the investigation of things. Things being investigated, knowledge became complete. Their knowledge being complete, their thoughts were sincere. Their thoughts being sincere, their hearts were then rectified. Their hearts being rectified, their persons were cultivated. Their persons being cultivated, their families were regulated. Their families being regulated, their states were rightly governed. Their states being rightly governed, the whole kingdom was made tranquil and happy. From the Son of Heaven, feudal lords, high stewards of lords, and warriors down to the mass of the people, all must consider the cultivation of the person as the root of a peaceful society. It cannot be that when the essential factor of self-education is neglected, that the family and the state and the world which should spring from it will be well ordered. It never has been that the case that the family, which is of great importance for the individual, has been slightly cared for, while at the same time the state and the world, which are of slight importance for the individual, have been greatly cared for.
That's a great passage. It really is speaking about the core of what is peace, right? It's coming from the individual, from the heart, to the family, to the nation, and then emanating to all under heaven, so to speak.
All under heaven.
Yeah. Oh, that's so wonderful. So all the key component I hear from this passage is knowledge, awareness, and cultivation.
That's right. In other words, at a certain point, it's true that imposed order will gain some semblance of stability, but that doesn't typically last. Because in the end, if we are submitting to authority without appreciating the basis for the authority, and the authority not appreciating the basis for what the impact of what they are doing individually and as a government, then of course it's very difficult to have that be stable. The reason why I'm a student, independent student of Chinese history, is because they chose to write the good, the bad, and the ugly down. And you tend to see that great families arise because the prior people did poorly. But by the time it gets down to the grandson's generation or the great-grandson's generation, particularly where we have multiple wives, it becomes very complicated.
Definitely.
And so until people start to realize, and each of us, of course, have to be the example of that, that I have to discipline myself and forego opportunities in order that I can fulfill the duties that will devolve to me.
Of course, the Chinese culture very much emphasizes the personal role in the whole of the relationship, and the more complex the relationship, the more demand on personal cultivation.
Exactly.
That goes back to the root of what you talk about in terms of peace.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So, later on in the program, we'll explore the spiritual practice you follow, Seicho-No-Ie. We'll look at awareness and cultivation. But now let's get to the Forgiveness Project.
Yes.
How is that project related to peace?
Okay. I think we all would hope that we can be the beneficiaries of a happy and comfortable life. I think that has been the goal of most people, except few of us realize sometimes the tragedies and the difficulties that we encounter are actually the means by which that awareness to actually apply that enlightened self-discipline arises comes because of the tragedy. Obviously, a lot of people understand Japanese language, or at least are knowledgeable enough to know that Japanese use the term arigato to express thank you. Meaning, thank you very much, arigato. But the meaning of the arigato, as an example, means that what I'm receiving from you is actually very precious. And I wasn't aware of the connection except one evening, because I am a lay teacher. I had to give a talk, and the family was the grandmother was Japanese, and I used the term that the son-in-law of the grandmother, the eldest daughter's husband was local Chinese, and I used the term arigatai. And he said, "Oh, Merritt, I know arigato. I don't understand arigatai. What's arigatai?" So that's the feeling of gratitude. Okay. Then, as we're going home, the young minister who happened to be in Honolulu at the time asked me, "Mr. Sakata, do you know how to write it in Chinese characters? Arigatai." And I said, "No, I don't." He says, "You write it with the character for to have or to exist, which is ari, the one that has like the moon underneath the hand, and katai, which is hard. Katai is hard. This is yawarakai. Yeah, so Japanese call this hard also muzukashi, or difficult. Okay, and they use a term, probably Chinese term, for misfortune, sai nan. That's a nan. Okay, so he says there was a Japanese, again, a group at the time that our group began, which was pre-Second World War Japan, that used a little motto which was nan ari gatashi. Nan, which is the misfortune, to have, makes one grateful. So I use that term, particularly with young kids. You know, there's an old song, "Don't it always seem to go? You don't know what you got till it's gone." And so why I'm active with groups like the Forgiveness Project is because each of us goes through those stages of crashing up against the wall at various times. And most of us would like to have sympathy and in a certain way, consolation for the difficulty we have had. And sometimes that is not necessarily the best understanding of our situation. And so, because we tend to be involved with a lot of people who actually have gone through unimaginable tragedy and are able to say, you know, having gone through that, it really has broadened my outlook so that I can function in my own life in a much more a constructive way. And so in a certain way, I should have been grateful to that. So for me to forgive is not a big thing. It's only natural. And it's that dynamic that most of us don't get. And so as we interact with people like that, it allows us not only to appreciate how difficult things have been for others, so that actually we can see our own difficulties and not really take that too much as a affliction. As an opportunity rather than affliction.
Kind of flip the coin, just to look at it as opportunity.
Exactly.
It's a hard journey to forgive, especially if you have been wronged. You know, I know the Hawaii Forgiveness Project has featured people who have family members being killed, the Hawaiian people who have lost their land and sovereignty, a lot of these kind of heart-wrenching stories. But then for people to come through the journey, through pain, and come to a place of forgiving the perpetrators is a powerful journey. And that's probably a journey to peace. Would you say that?
I think what happens is, of course, you didn't live in this country during those days, but in the lead up to the worst parts of the Vietnam War, there was that article, there was a cartoon a series called Pogo. I don't know if you would have remembered that. You probably wouldn't. But Pogo was a comic strip, cartoon characters in a comic strip. And one of the lines that was memorable, it was, "We have seen the enemy, and the enemy is us." In other words, if we can appreciate the fact and be totally cold-blooded and realistic about ourselves, we have to realize that the world is like a mirror, you know. So if we have an enemy out there, he has a reason to think of us as an enemy. We may never have thought of him as an enemy, but he has a reason to think of us as an enemy. We should find out what that must be and correct that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So everything starts from one's own heart.
That's why I like this. Yeah, that's why I like this. It's good to have a hope, but the hope without an action program that we can take, participate in, if not take mastery of. It's a hopeless task.
What's interesting, I really appreciate this approach to peace because, you know, in the world out there, there are a lot of conflicts and wars at different places, and people, politicians sometimes tend to think we need to fight for peace. But this is a very different approach to say, well, you know, look within to see whether you can find peace inside yourself, and if you do, you can help to bring peace.
And I think the point that you're raising is so critical, because we tend to think that the people who are in power are virtuous. And so in a certain way, they've risen above, hopefully, our foolishness in order to have gotten those responsibilities. But actually, especially in the United States, it's a more complicated matter than that, because we are electing those people. So if actually the people who are elected seem to us to be lacking in virtue, potentially corrupt, then we have to ask ourselves, what was it that led us as a group to have put them into that position? So at a certain point, it was our failure in not being able to judge good character, which means we better go examine our own character.
That's it. That's very, very interesting. That's right. Yeah. Well, let's take a short break.
Yes.
This is ThinkTech Asia, and I'm your host, Hong Jiang. We've been speaking with Merritt Sakata on Let Us Pray for World Peace. We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Yamashita, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And urban transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Thank you.
Hi, we're back. We're live. This is ThinkTech Asia, and we've been talking about world peace with Merritt Sakata. I'm your host, Hong Jiang. So Merritt, right before the break, we were talking about some of your understanding of world peace, which is really impressive. And it really is the core of what the world, you know, is about and what humanity is about. That's really, really interesting. And especially to look at peace from a perspective of the personal cultivation is very refreshing. I think we can all get there. The world will be a peaceful place. And like I mentioned in the introduction, that you've been involved in many different efforts in the community. In addition to the Hawaii Forgiveness Project, you also have been instrumental in the what's called All Believers Network. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your involvement there. What is first of all, what is the All Believers Network?
I first encountered the All Believers Network because Roger Epstein, who is kind of the spearhead for the Forgiveness Project,
and
suggested...
he's another great person in the community fostering a lot of these.
Right, and he suggested I meet Salim Ahmed, who was one of the founders, together with Sister Joan Chatfield, of course. And Sister Joan, all of us are involved in the same things, but there's different aspects. Whereas the Forgiveness Project is in a certain way very secular. The All Believers Network, because of different things that had happened, drew together a number of people from very, very different and disparate spiritual backgrounds. And all of them generally are practitioners, not necessarily clergy. And when I first became involved with them, the idea was we should really be examining our relationship with the traditions that we came out of, because if we're all together here, my conclusion is we don't only operate within our own group. And so that was the way it happened. And when I first came, because I was a new guy, they're talking about what was your faith journey? And one thing led to another, and we had their monthly meetings, which are just open meetings. This group is a nonprofit, but there's no money. I mean, there's just everybody doing volunteer. It's like Forgiveness Project in a lot of ways. We're just doing it because we think it's worthwhile. And because the person who was organizing the monthly programs had to take a break, somebody asked me if I wouldn't like to get involved in helping organize a monthly program, so that's what I did. And because typically when you have to put together a presentation for a program, it puts a lot of pressure on a person, you know, and if he's got to talk about something, not always that we practice very well, but this is what we are supposed to be practicing, it puts a lot of strain.
That's right.
And so it's hard to get volunteers to do that, because in a certain way, you confront the fact that, gee, am I a hypocrite? You know, so you know, it's a little bit of a stretch sometimes. But nevertheless, what it is, if a person can be concerned that I should not be a hypocrite, that's the kind of person that you really want to have. Because in life, it's very difficult to do what you know you're supposed to do. So unfortunately, too many of us live by do what I tell you, not what I do. You know, and so in the end, that dynamic of being able to again look inward and see oneself as progressing toward a more enlightened, virtuous, noble condition is actually the path everybody goes. And each path, although it may be leading to the same end, is distinctive. The disciplines are all different. And if we have the idea that you can pick and choose among the disciplines, then what it really is we are being motivated not by the attainment, but by comfort. And so how can we get to the point where we can use our own experience to help other people along the way? Hey, just keep on going, you'll find it. And so we chose different angles. So we have different series going on. The one we have currently was inspired by Lao Tzu.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes, the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
And we understood that Lao Tzu, being an old man, was going into retirement for various reasons. I can just imagine why he would have.
That's right.
And the gatekeeper says, "Oh man, before you go," because apparently he had a reputation of some quality.
More than a sage, like an enlightened person.
Yes,
Yeah.
and he said, before you go, because he probably would never come back again, leave something behind. And apparently, what he did write down, and that's a story anyway. Even today, we find great value in, and it's not complicated.
It's the Tao Te Ching, 5,000 characters.
See, I don't know,
Yeah.
but can we appreciate the fact that those same situations that were so valuable then are also very useful today? And so that's what we have been doing. We're calling our current series "Now That You Ask Me." And so what we've done is just having different people come and talk about what, if they knew that this may be the last 2 weeks of their life, what, in the same way, you know, what would have been important. Our current series is kind of diverted into talking about what's called pu'uhonua. It's a Hawaiian concept, and people consider that as a sanctuary. But I think it's much more than sanctuary. Because in the old days, in Hawaii in particular, and I think Japan had the same situation during their warring states period, if you were a defeated warrior, you can just expect that your enemy will exterminate not only you, but your whole family. And so everything was really at pain of death. But if you could somehow get to the temple or the pu'uhonua, and they let you in, then your opponent would generally honor the fact that it's a sacred place and would not enter to kill you.
Huh, interesting.
And so most of us think, oh, that's really, you know, how lucky of me, if I can go over there, I'm safe. But I don't think that's really what happened. I think probably the people that were there were really the enlightened priests who had given the people in responsibility why they should make certain policies. And of course, the guy in charge gets to make the penalty that goes with the policy. But if you got to go there, actually what you're doing is you are presenting yourself to the person that inspired or directed the executioner. So it's sort of like going to the Court of Appeals. Mm-hmm. And if you can actually, in being there, show yourself to be a person who kind of understood why those rules were there, if they were to let you out, it's like being pardoned. And so it's with that in mind. So we're talking about that because in Hawaii in particular, being a small place, so many people find that just getting along is so difficult, and yet even though the community is so small, there's all of these undercurrents. And so we believe that if we can restore that dynamic, it would be good for the country, and if it's good for the community, and of course if it works for the community, then that could be the model for other places as well. So it's the same idea. How do you get the guy who's out of step back in step? Because the guy that's out of step is probably the smarter guy than the guy that's already in step, except he doesn't respect the authority.
So metaphorically, is this concept of Pu Honua representing a place, kind of a spiritual divine place, where the attachment to the self goes away a little bit, and then you get to a place of a non-judgment and reconciliation and peace?
Well, it also does harken back to, like the Catholic methodology because, Catholicism, when it expanded, they went into a lot of territories where what the existing practices were not necessarily the most enlightened. And so within some of their disciplines, which today seem to us outrageous, made a lot of sense. And hopefully the priest was a person of spiritual authority and virtue. And so to have someone come to him to confess, "Oh, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Of course, he's going to say, "Don't do that again." But most people would like to be forgiven, but not commanded not to do it again. So in the end, that is the dynamic, is we need to make sure that each of us today, whatever we say, we are actually practicing what we preach. And
Go ahead.
well, so one of the passages in the Tao Te Ching is chapter 44, and there's many different translations, but this one I received from Lillian Chang, who is a Taoist priest. And she says that this translation probably captures the Chinese feeling, the culture. And so I'd like to use this one. There are other ones that are more poetic and maybe a little bit more beautiful, but maybe not so much seriously to the point. And this one is the importance of virtue. What is well planted is not easily uprooted. What is firmly embraced is not easy to let go. From generation to generation, his offspring can carry out ancestral sacrifices continuously. Cultivate the way, or the Tao, yourself. Your virtue will be genuine. Cultivate the way in the family, and your virtue is so sincere and abundant that your family members will be prosperous because of cause and effect. Cultivate the way in the village. Villagers will become enlightened by your virtuous deeds. Cultivate the way in the state. People having virtue would enjoy prosperity. Cultivate the way in the world, and people will become virtuous throughout the universe. Therefore, after understanding the truth, I can use it to judge and observe myself, other families, other villages, and other states, and to further and the future development of the world. How do I know about the world? It is through the study of the Tao.
In a way, it's similar to what you quoted earlier on the great learning about one's own role in bringing about the enlightenment or peace in the world.
As I understand it, I don't know so much in China, but I guess in other places, some people say, oh, the Confucius was talking about it one way, and Lao Tzu was talking about the other way, and people have preference of one way or the other, but it's the same thing.
When you go deep, it's very similar, and it goes. Both Confucianism and Taoism were connected to the Book of Change or earlier, Chinese understandings. So the form is different, which goes back to what you were talking about, the All Believers Network. The different faith followers follow a different form, but look like the underneath essence is very similar.
And I think the point that you're making is a critical one, because most of us think that by being loyal to our group, that trumps doing it the right way. And in the end, that's why I study Chinese things, because they wrote everything down, and maybe the grandpa got it right. But by the time it gets to the grandson, he doesn't get it right anymore, because he presumes upon the fact that we are now in charge.
Yeah.
And so in the end, it's an ongoing process. So in the end, if we can begin to acknowledge our own prior failing and say, I realize that what we had done, unfortunately, had to happen. But let's not do this again.
Yeah, definitely. Again, it's a great discussion, and let's take another break. This is ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Hong Jiang, and we've been talking about world peace. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard, and I host the show Center Stage on the ThinkTech Hawaii digital series right here every Wednesday from 2 to 3 Hawaii time. I would really love to have you watch the show and see what we do here. I talk with some of the most amazing people, artists, most of them, all of them involved in some sort of artistic process. And our goal here on the show is to dig into that artistic process, and you would not believe what some people say, what some people do, what people go through to express. And these are people who have to express somehow, and I find that infinitely interesting. Not only that they have to express, but how they end up doing it. I really hope that you will watch the show and enjoy talking with some of these people the same way that I do. Thanks, and I hope to see you soon on Center Stage on the ThinkTech Hawaii digital series, Wednesdays from 2 to 3. See you soon.
Hello, we're back. We're live. This is ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Hong Jiang, and we've been speaking with Merritt Sakata on world peace. And again, Merritt has been involved in many different initiatives in the community to foster world peace, and also his own practice of a Seicho-No-Ie is also it's a foundation for him to be engaged in this effort. So let's talk more, get to your practice, your personal practice of Seicho-No-Ie. What does it mean, first of all, and what is it?
Yeah. Seicho-No-Ie is a group that actually began in Japan in 1930. The founder had encountered a lot of personal difficulties himself, and at a certain point, he thought he was going to save the world, and it was all going to hell on him in a certain way. And it occurred to him that I have to do something. I can go into a long thing about it, but it's probably not so important. But in one of the books that really impressed me a lot when I came to be involved is a book called The Divine Education and Spiritual Training of Mankind, when he talks about the transition that he made into doing this. And what really happened was he ended up feeling that he should be a publisher of a magazine. And the magazine would be focused on bright thoughts as opposed to being someone that scolded other people as to what they were doing wrong. Talk about let's get it right. You know, that even the bad things in life has a bright side. And he thought that it would enlighten people. And all of a sudden he was getting these letters back after about 6 months of giving away this free magazine. And people were saying, oh, my cancer went away, my tuberculosis went away, I'm finally getting along with my wife, and very practical things. And at first, he was kind of upset because he wanted to enlighten people. Oh, how wise you are, but that wasn't the response. And he came to realize, oh, that's really what it is. All of the great teachings were really to be applied to daily living, but few of us understand them. And so he says, some people may regard Seicho-No-Ie as a religion, that's up to them. However, I prefer to consider it to be a non-denominational movement that enlightens one to the truth through literary writing. So much of what we have was originally written. And because it was written, and of course, like we all know, that's why we have so-called seminars, right? You have the book, you're reading it, but you still have questions. So we all get together and we talk about it. You know, what does it really mean? How can I apply it? And in that process, we learn from each other's lessons. So Seicho-No-Ie really, he says, you can look at it as the house of infinite growth, which is not incorrect. And that can be basically allude to the process of evolution, evolving. But at the same time, he says that it's the eternal now. In other words, at each moment, we have a choice as to what we will do next. What has happened to us so far was accumulation and cause and effect cycle of what had happened before. But what happens next, we have influence over. We can choose to continue what has been done, and not everything was good and not everything was bad, but that's our choice. Nobody's compelling us to do this. At the same time, depending on what it is that we do, infinite possibilities are there. So he calls it the great universe. And so it's more a movement to make people aware of their capabilities and possibilities to grow past whatever is happening. So when we talk about stuff like world peace, it's because we are actually working on solving the problem with ourselves that potentially will become one of the other examples that will give people say, well, maybe I should put my past habits behind and try differently. But that requires, again, not luck. It requires a certain appreciation of the fact that I have to harvest what I have sown.
I want to go back to your personal story.
Yes.
That you, as a Japanese descent, living here, and your ancestors practiced Buddhism, and you had some experience with Christianity. How did you get to Seicho-No-Ie?
Good question. My father died when I was 5. And when my father died, like in Hawaii today, this season we call Obon, right? And so this is like Qingming, you know, where you go and pay our respects to the ancestors. We would do that every year because that's a tradition. My father died, and so we would have a memorial service for him every year. And I was young because I was 5. And so we'd be at the temple, and the minister in those days would only speak Japanese. And it happened to be Pure Land, Hong Jiang, Jodo Shinshu. And they would read the sutras in Japanese. And I hit my mother and said, "What are they saying?" And she said, "Shh, just listen." I said, "I'm listening, but I want to know what they're saying." She says, "I don't know." And that was a shock to me. I understand now how most people look at religious traditions as being something we don't question, we just do. Nevertheless, if we do not know why, in this world of globalization, what we do is we condemn our children to be critics because we cannot explain to them why it is that we do what we do.
Right, yeah.
So now, that is my father's side of the family. My mother's side of the family belonged to a Zen sect. And so I remember my grandparents every morning repeating sutras themselves in front of the family altars. And I used to watch them and I said, whoa. And they did it as not wondering what's going to happen to me, but this is something that we do, you know. And I think, you know, probably in China, so also in Japan, the people that really know, for them, spiritual things are a lifestyle. It's not to prevent something bad from happening. It's to make sure good happens. You know, that it's to create that humble heart. Yeah. Anyway, so now I became a Boy Scout. I love Boy Scout, and my mother wanted me to be a Boy Scout because my father had died, and she says, you need to be around men more than too many women in your life. So we happened to meet at a Japanese Christian church. And I would be a Christian today, except that just before I graduated from college, they did a revival as a summer camp like. And they said, oh, you should, you know, we all have to give our lives to Jesus Christ so we can go to heaven. It's too bad that your ancestors didn't have this opportunity, but you can go to heaven. And I said to myself, you know, I remember my grandparents, and I know what kind of people they are. And if anybody's going to go to heaven, it's going to be them. So if I have to hang around with you and tell people that they have to be concerned that they cannot go to heaven because your grandparents didn't have the choice, I said to myself, I think I will take my chances. And so I didn't have any place to go, and now I'm becoming a conscious objector. And in the application, it says, where did you learn these things from? Because it's set up because certain teachings require you to be pacifist. And so if naturally you're a pacifist, it's only natural that, well, since God is a higher authority than the secular authority, I guess we should let you out. But that was not my situation. I was talking about cause and effect, because that's how I grew up. And so I said, you know, I will not be the kind of person that goes out and kills somebody that will now force another person to become our country's enemy. Better you kill me. And I had resolved in my mind I would end up in prison. I didn't. But after that, when that was happening, is now when I'm coming down through, my mother came up for graduation, because all this happened as I was graduating from college, and we ended up at a hotel in San Francisco that had a Japanese bookstore in it. And I prowled around and I picked up a book, which wasn't the one that's published by Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai. It was a regular commercial book, and I read it and I said, oh, what the Buddha was teaching is the same thing Jesus was teaching in the New Testament. So it's my conclusion today that Jesus was actually teaching Buddhism.
Makes sense in
Because
terms of the fundamental message.
Not only that, but he was on the Silk Road. You know, that's where Israel was, on the Silk Road. They were traders. And so in order to be able to survive the bandits, you had to be a person of some virtue so that the bandits would let you through knowing that you were not a threat. And so it's my opinion, and just my personal opinion, nobody told me this, that it would make sense, because that was kind of advanced. And in my mind, if you look at the Old Testament a certain way, it teaches the same thing. It teaches cause and effect. It's like reading the Chinese classics, you know, rise and fall of families.
And also in Buddhism, you talk a lot about the karma, karmic
right.
retribution.
That's
It's
right.
cause and effect.
That's right, it's cause and
Yeah,
effect.
yeah.
We're reaping what we have sown. Knowingly or unknowingly, that's what's happening.
Was this book on Seicho-No-Ie or not yet?
No. And so here I am, I'm back in Honolulu. My wife and I don't go to church, although my wife is Caucasian, and she went to Christian church. She used to play the organ for their congregational church, and ours was a congregational, the Japanese congregational church. And because we had to have our house blessed, because we bought a property and we're going to build a house, we need to have the house blessed. And that's my first encounter with somebody who was actually of the teaching, and he became my mentor.
Oh, I see.
But before that, a magazine, which I told you that the founder had decided to publish, it continues. It's now in the English version, it's called The Truth of Life. But at that time, it was, in Japan, it's Seicho-No-Ie. That's how the name came, because of the magazine. And when the thing showed up at my mother's house, and my wife and I used to go there every Sunday for dinner. She would make us dinner and make us take home the leftovers, because she knew how hard we were working, and because she had been a single mother because my father died, she felt that it was something she would like to do. And all of a sudden this magazine shows up, and it answered a lot of questions from me. Because I was 5, I had always been looking around for man, a good man, to have been perfect like I would have expected my father to have been. And we all know nobody's perfect. But
right.
because my father died when I was 5, he was on a pedestal to me, and I was looking for somebody that could teach me what I would have expected my father to have taught me, and nobody did. Actually, they had. It's just that I used to think that I would follow somebody that was perfect, but they don't exist, I come to realize now.
That's right, yeah.
And in the magazine, what happened was, it just said something so simple. It said, you don't have to look too far to find wisdom. It's inside of you.
It's very empowering.
Yeah. Nobody has to tell you why the rose is beautiful, but when you see one, it's beautiful. Because you can see the pattern. So if we can learn to recognize that the wisdom doesn't come from the outside, the wisdom comes from the inside. That is what's necessary. And for the first time I said, oh, that's what it is. I never thought of it that way.
So is that the essence of a Seicho-No-Ie?
In the end, it is, because most of us are governed by habit.
Yeah.
We fail to realize that we actually, each moment we have a choice. We're making choices. That concept is so broad today, except that just because you can make a choice doesn't undo the past mistake. So part of the practice is to acknowledge the fact that we have to let go of these things. Not only that, we have to give credit to all the people who contributed to it, because had that not happened, we wouldn't know any better. By seeing the mistake, you say, oh, not only is that not good, I have to make sure I don't contribute to it. And that's the return of a certain primal innocence that all of us have, but most of us fail to realize is the ultimate, is to have that innocence again.
So now you've been a teacher, lay teacher of Seicho-No-Ie for how long?
Maybe 20 years, maybe a little more.
How many people are practicing this roughly, according to what you know, in Hawaii?
I think when you say practice, that really is a hard question to determine, because even myself, I'm not sure that what I practice is completely attuned with what the awareness should be. And that should be the goal. So everybody's moving along, and my propagation partner, unfortunately, she's 98 years old, and until she just made 98, she was fine, but now she's pretty much incapacitated. She taught me something when my big last transition, which probably was less than 10 years ago. No, it would be a little bit more than that. I used to think that practicing what we are taught is almost like the antidote to a problem. But it really isn't. But I had that thinking. So when we have a problem, I say, oh, I better go back to practicing. That's how most of us,
I see.
yeah, most of us think of it that way, unfortunately. Yeah. And so I went to see her after I had some other advice, and she tells me, what's your problem? I said, oh, my company is going to hell in a handbasket, because I was really having a problem with my company. And I said, I'm doing all of these things, the practices, and it's not working. And she says, that's not what we're teaching. By doing these practices, you change. When you change, the world is now responding to a different person. And I said, click, I understand. So now when you say practice, how many people are practicing it? I have to say, not all of us, because even I was in the same situation, really get that that's what it is.
I do see what you mean. It's a hard question. How many people are trying to practice? Maybe that's the question.
That's also a real good question, because again, Seicho-No-Ie began in Japan. And as Taniguchi Sensei mentioned, the founder, said that I prefer to consider a non-denominational movement that enlightens one to the truth through literary writing. Most of those writings were in the Japanese language.
I see.
And being in the Japanese language, not all of them got translated into English. I think there's more books that were translated into Portuguese, because the people in Brazil, I think, are much more earnest than we in the United States.
I see. Okay.
And I believe that if you just talk about numbers, since the time in which Seicho-No was really one of the big games in town, it's gone down considerably, because most people today kind of get it without seeing it as a lifestyle practice. They're not being confronted by many of the problems. And so in a certain way, our membership has declined substantially, because the old people who really were the ones that in a certain way got their college education through these studies. And they did a good job. They passed on a good life to the children. And so they don't have the same kind of problems that drive a person to spiritual discipline.
In the next just minute and a half that we have for the program, I wanted to have you speak just briefly about prayer. in Seicho-No-Ie
Yes.
and world peace, because
Yes.
there seems to be just prayers
Yes.
for world peace.
Yes. Most of us in the Western world think of prayer as beseeching someone, but Japanese look at prayer as a statement of fact. This is how it really is, to acknowledge the ideal condition. So as we acknowledge the ideal condition, of course, it makes us aware of the fact that if there's a discrepancy between the ideal condition and now, the responsibility to make that happen belongs partly, at least, to us.
So these prayers were a form of reinforcement to tell us where we need to go.
That's
basically.
right.
Yeah.
We need to accomplish this.
I see, I see. Well, this is great, and thank you so much, Merritt,
you.
for joining us here.
Thank you.
And again, looking at world peace as a state of the mind, and even more than that, state of the being, is really the key, the core of humanity and why we're here. And thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for joining us today.
Thank you.
And this is ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Hong Jiang. We've been speaking with Merritt Sakata on a topic about world peace. Let us pray for world peace. So we are closing today's program, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you. Goodbye.